Hey guys, welcome to this episode of our video lectures. The topics of this episode are aggression and play. Intuitively you would think that those two topics are not actually related to one another. But depending on the particular study system that you're focusing on, it can actually be intimately linked. So I'm out here in the central tablelands in New South Wales again, and I'm out here doing a project on eastern grey kangaroos. As with a lot of macropods, so macropods are kangaroos, wallabies, wallaroos, eastern grey kangaroos in particular are sexually sized dimorphic, and specifically male bisexually sized dimorphic. Now all that simply means is that males are bigger than females. On average, the typical male is about a third larger than most females. Humans are another sexually sized dimorphic, male biased species, so men tend to be on average a little bit larger, more muscular than women. So in the case of eastern grey kangaroos, males compete for access to females. This is common in the natural world, as you know. In these kangaroos, males will form harems, so they'll try and monopolise access to the females within those harems. And to defend those harems, they spend a lot of time fighting one another. These fights can be pretty strenuous, they can be very violent, and they can go on for a very long time. Now, as a consequence of that physical combat, what's happened is that selection has focused on male size. And because, as you would imagine, being larger has its benefits when you're getting into a situation of physical combat, right? So what has happened is that over time, the selection pressure on males to be large so that they can better fight other males has resulted in this male biased sexual size dimorphism, so males being larger than females, and because of that size advantage during physical combat. Now, if you look across all the different species of macropods, and they're pretty diverse, as I said, they go from kangaroos, wallaroos, right down to wallabies, there is actually a lot of variation in size dimorphism between the sexes. So eastern grey kangaroos, red kangaroos are at the peak. The males are the largest relative to females. At the other end are things like Palmer wallabies, swamp wallabies, and these in these species the sexes are roughly quite similar. So they're tending towards monomorphism. So monomorphism is that both sexes are approximately the same size, or on average they're the same size. So what I'm trying to get at is if you actually look at the degree of male biased size dimorphism among closely related species, you can actually get a reasonably good idea about what the likely social system, the reproductive system of those species are. So in the case of strong or extreme male biased sexual size dimorphism, these are species that are typically associated with males having to compete directly with one another through fighting for access to females. In eastern grey kangaroos, it's the formation of these harems and defending access to those harems, becoming the dominant male. In other systems, such as lizards, males are defending space, so territories, and those territories overlap the home ranges of females, and as a consequence of defending those territories, males are trying to monopolise access to those females. But if you go down to the other end of the spectrum, where the sexes tend to be quite similar in size, you find that you don't have this type of aggression among males for competition for mating opportunities. And often what you see, particularly in macropods, those species that tend to be monomorphic also tend to be relatively asocial. So you only tend to see one maybe 2 individuals at any one time. So swamp wallabies are a particularly nice example of that. In contrast, the eastern grey kangaroos, these guys form very large mobs. At this particular site that I'm at now, the average mob this morning was about 60 to 65 individuals, and within that large mob you'll have these subsets or these groups forming where these males are trying to monopolise access to the females. So, aggression leads to sexual-sized dimorphism when males are competing physically for access to females. Now, the other topic that I was going to talk about today is play behaviour. Now, in eastern grey kangaroos, the juveniles and subadults will often spend a lot of time playing, but in particular they'll spend a lot of time play fighting with one another. And there is a lot of uncertainty about what the function of play is, just generally in the animal world, and in a particular case of these eastern grey kangaroos, what it is that these play fighting functions as. Now, often we fall into this trap that we observe something in nature and we have to come up with an adaptive explanation to it. So it could be that play is simply that. So animals are playing because they enjoy playing, so on and so forth. There is no particular adaptive reason for it. The flip side is that perhaps there is an adaptive function to play behaviour, in particular play fighting. One of the hypotheses is that males, as juveniles and subadults, are play fighting with their peers to effectively get their skill set up, so training themselves for their future role, hopefully in their minds, of being the dominant male and monopolising access to females. So that play, while it's not very violent, it's a bit of a scrap, it's pretty playful. You can see that when you're watching it. There's no really a winner or a loser. The idea here is that they're effectively practicing fighting for later on in life. And that's a relatively obvious hypothesis, but the problem with that hypothesis is that would predict that it's mostly the boys that are doing play fighting, and the boys play fighting with other boys. But what you see in eastern grey kangaroos is that you see play fighting among boys and girls, so juveniles and subadult males and females. Females are play fighting with one another, they're play fighting with the males, sometimes they're even play fighting with mum. So that hypothesis could still be viable, but it doesn't really explain why females or the girls are play fighting. So the second hypothesis is that play fighting is its adaptive function, if there is adaptive function, is to cement social bonds. In particular, social bonds among members of the same family, for example, social bonds among members of a particular group. So these are large mobs of kangaroos, but there will often be smaller groups within that larger mob. So this play fighting, this interaction is just general social behaviour, and again it's there to cement social bonds between members. And the idea would be is that those social bonds may actually retain through development, through into adulthood as well. So you'll tend to see males and females tending to associate based on whether they are associating perhaps play fighting as juveniles. So play in the animal world, as I said, is a bit of a puzzle to our researchers. You'll see a lot of animals play, in juveniles in particular, but you'll see adults playing as well. You just need to go out to Botany Bay, La Perouse, for example, and see the dolphins playing in the surf at the bows of these cargo ships as they come into Port Botany. There doesn't appear to be any function to that behaviour. They're just jumping out of the water and they appear to be just enjoying themselves. So perhaps, again, this play behaviour has no adaptive significance, but of course it could also be, again, some type of affiliation behaviour, cementing those social bonds between particular groups of individuals. So in terms of the study that I'm doing out here, I've been coming out here for a number of years, and I spent a lot of time in that thing over there. So that's a hide, if you haven't realised that already. It's just a glorified tent, to be honest with you. Eastern grey kangaroos are crepuscular, so a lot of their activity is concentrated around dawn and also dusk. So if you want to study their social behaviour, their aggression, their play behaviour, the time to do that is first thing in the morning or late in the afternoon. So I've been in that hide since 4 o'clock this morning, and I have a video recorder and also I have a digital camera. So all the work that I'm doing to a large extent is purely observational. It's recording behaviour, it's taking photos of individuals. We can actually identify individuals based on the morphology of their ears. We've got a special program back in the lab that we can trace the shape of the ear, and we can use that to identify particular individuals. So each individual has its own unique shape of the ear, so it's almost like a fingerprint for eastern grey kangaroos. So that's important because I've been coming out here for a number of years and been following the same individuals from year to year. So if you want to test a longitudinal hypothesis such as play behaviour play fighting specifically is related to aggression and real fighting as adults, you need to ideally follow individuals from juveniles and subadults all the way through to adulthood and see whether there is a link between the frequency of play behaviour, their frequency of play fighting with particular individuals, particular sex of individuals, and where those individuals end up in the dominant hierarchy later on in life. So identifying individuals is important, and recording the social behaviour so that we can take it back to the lab and we can record all sorts of things from the overall duration of combat, the likely winner of a particular bout, how many hits, how many instances that we have of the stereotyped behaviour that often starts off physical fights, where males do the stereotyped scratching, and they also do a lot of grass pulling as well. It's all standoff just before they get into the nitty-gritty of getting into physical combat. So I spent a lot of hours sitting in a hide before dawn and recording the social behaviour of these animals. And I do this for a couple of weeks every year. And with that, I'm able to accumulate a fairly large library of who's who in the particular mobs, who's associated with the particular individuals, and I can also get information on who's reproducing. I can see which females are carrying pouch young, which females are interacting with particular males, so on and so forth. So even through purely observational techniques, sure, we've got some sophisticated shape analysis and of course video recordings. At the end of the day, it's all observation, and you can still get a lot of information and test some hypotheses associated with particular behaviours. Of course, you don't really need to have a fancy hide. You can park a vehicle, leave it overnight, it's just as good. Actually more comfortable as well. So there's been a lot of research on the potential adaptive significance of forming large groups. In the case of these eastern grey kangaroos, individual kangaroos have to face potential predation threat, occasionally from dingoes, more commonly from foxes and feral cats. Obviously, As an individual kangaroo, if you're a member of a very large group, you effectively dilute the potential predation threat because there's a whole range of other individuals that that predator could potentially attack. What that means is being part of large groups means you can devote your activity to other things other than vigilance behaviour, checking in with the surrounding environment, making sure that there are no potential predation threats. And in the case of these eastern grey kangaroos, it means that individual kangaroos can spend more time foraging and also finding potential mates if you're a male.